Trump says he loves Canada, but it should not exist. Trump's insistence that Canada is not a real country bears a striking resemblance to Putin in the run-up to his invasion of Ukraine. I kid you not, the quote-unquote liberal media is arguing that Trump is acting like Putin with Canada, look at this one. Look at this. Trump isn't joking about wanting to annex Canada. Al Jazeera, closest target. Why is Trump so focused on Canada? CNN, Canadians are taking Trump's annexation talk very seriously. New poll, just 8% of Americans want to annex Canada. So Trump was asked about the tariffs, and he actually said something to the effect of, at some point, it shouldn't be a country. At some point, someone drew an imaginary line and separated us, but it would be great as the 51st state, which in all seriousness makes literally no sense because there's how many provinces do you have? 10 or something? 11?
10 provinces, 3 territories, 40 million people.
Yeah, that's not one state. That's 10 states. And then, so I think the appropriate thing to do is to invade, be greeted as liberals. I'm kidding, by the way. But Trudeau has responded saying, or Trudeau has made the statement, he believes that Trump's tariff plan is to destroy the economy of Canada so that it will be easier to annex.
Come on. Come on.
Don't you want to be an American?
Come on.
Okay, let's give a real life example here. So these tariffs were announced. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs, 25% across the board. A plumber wrote, and I retweeted this the other day, great. Now, every single thing we bring into Canada, we're going to be paying 25% more on. Because when they slap tariffs on America, they're taxing themselves, right? It's to reduce supply coming in from America. But
Americans won't pay more.
American Standard, Toto, all these plumbing fixtures, they all come from America. So now if you're building a house, you're going to be paying 25% more as a Canadian on your bathtubs and your sinks and your faucets and everything. You're going to be spending thousands of dollars more. Why? Not because of Trump, because of the Canadian response to Trump. The last thing we should be doing is putting on retaliatory tariffs. We should be acting like statesmen and working with Trump. If he's unhappy with our trade agreement, then we can look at tweaking it. It was negotiated about 7 years ago. We can tweak it a little bit. But all they're doing with this trade war is hurting Canadians far more than Americans.
So I can't speak to Canada as a nation. I can speak to the United States. We have the means to produce anything we need. We have beautiful Alaska, which we should invade and occupy. For some reason, it's empty. And many, not everybody, but a lot of people in Alaska would love it if the government actually said, hey, how about we expand industry and development in Alaska, which people need to understand. Everybody just assumes that Canada is ice cold and like everybody's living in the snow. But the further north you go, the longer growing season you have. You have really long, you have summers with really long days. And so actually in Alaska, I think it's where they grew like the world record watermelon or some ridiculous thing. Because in the summer, it's nuts. We have an opportunity here in the United States. I can't speak for your fixtures or whatever, but I can tell you is tariffs will not, in the broad sense, make things more expensive for the people of this country. The reason I can't speak to Canada because I don't know what capability you guys have of making plumbing fixtures. In the United States, I know we can. So, for instance, auto manufacturing. The real simple version is if we are competing against countries with no environmental regulations and with no labor standards, they will be able to produce cars cheaper. Sure, fine. When you put a tariff on those products, in the extreme short term, if there is no available products in the country, yes, the price is going to go up because the company that is producing those and exporting them into your country has a monopoly. To be completely honest, anybody has a monopoly, they can charge you whatever they want. But if there's any competition, so let's say there are cars made in the United States and cars made in Mexico. The cars made in Mexico, let's say they're $20,000, probably low for a car these days. And their profit margin, let's say they make $5,000 per car. I don't know, it's probably a ridiculous number. It's a huge margin, 25%. In America, they're selling for $22,000 and struggling to compete with Mexico. Trump says, okay, we're doing a 25%. Well, we're going to do a 20% tariff. The car from Mexico now costs $24,000 for the company that's trying to import it into the country to sell. They say, we can't. No one will buy from us because the American-made car is 22. So what did the importers do? They eat the loss. If they had a 25% margin, they absorb that in their cost to stay competitive with American-made products, with home country products. The problem only arises if there is a monopoly or if your country is incapable of supplying these products to themselves, in which case the tariffs never mattered. If Canada can't make plumbing fixtures, then every company in the United States could just be like, hey guys, it's not illegal for us to price fix Canadian goods. The Canadian government can't do anything about it. Let's increase the cost of all of our plumbing fixtures by 10% because they're dependent upon us and they can't make their own products. The tariff doesn't change that. So I am for the tariffs. We work in the skateboard industry. We work in coffee. I can tell you the tariffs have only benefited us. I love it.
Yeah, but the only tariffs hurting Canadians are the ones that the Canadian politicians are putting in place. This is my whole point. If you want, so when Trump is putting on tariffs, all that does to Canada is it hurts our exports. And yes, that's a big deal. It's also hurting American companies and people as well. And this is why we have trade agreements. And the last thing we should be doing is all freaking out and saying that Trump is going to annex the country.
I don't know.
We should just be negotiating trade agreements that are beneficial to each country.
Look, Canada's cool and all,
It's not that hard.
I don't think they are. I think America's too big, and it's a big country. Some say it's the biggest and the best. It's certainly not the biggest. Russia is, but the United States can and should be producing everything on its own before it is giving away our refining, our manufacturing, our mining, whatever it may be, to literally any other country.
Every country should negotiate trade agreements that benefit their country the most.
Yeah.
That's the point of having a nation, is when you're the prime minister or president of a country, your job is to do the best thing for your people.
And the issue I see is that the past 30 years, the United States government has negotiated very, very bad deals that have hurt the American worker and destroyed our manufacturing base and the working class in this country, notably with all of the jobs moving to China or Mexico. Now Trump says, let's renegotiate. And what happens? Look, we were given a premium deal to all of these countries, to Canada, maybe not as much as China, to be honest, or Europe. I think China was the biggest recipient of all of this stuff. And then we have clothing made in Bangladesh and Indonesia. Trump says, we as a nation will not survive unless we have a strong economy, which means we need to be competitive. The problem? You've got lower standards in China, you got no standards in China, smog, you can't even see. And in Mexico, way lower standards and way lower costs. An American company cannot compete with slave labor and no environmental regulations.
Right. And Canada is not as big of a threat to the U.S., obviously, as countries like China, because we don't have cheap labor like they do in China or Taiwan or Pakistan or Vietnam or wherever. And if you look back in history, it was a huge mistake to have as much free trade as we have had with those nations, because now, like an addict, we're dependent on them. We're dependent on them for cheap goods, and we're also dependent on them for immigration. Because if we stopped immigration, our economy would crater.
I think this was widely discussed in the 2000s. There were a lot of prominent individuals who wanted to, quote unquote, normalize the North American economic bloc, is how it was described. So Canada's economy, what in the 90s, what was it like? 3 Canadian dollars is $1 US or something like that?
No, our dollar, honestly, right now is about as low as it ever gets. Right now, $1 US buys you about 150. We hover between that, and usually we're around 130. For a brief time, about 10 or 15 years ago, our dollar actually surpassed yours, but then it went right back.
Wow.
But it's usually around 130.
Okay, yeah, it looks like it. So I was wrong about that. It's usually around that mark. I remember when I went and visited Canada, a lot of people told me that they prefer it when the U.S. dollar is stronger than the Canadian, because Americans come and throw money around because they get more service for it, and the people in Canada make more money off of tourists and the service sector and things like this. Mm-hmm. So there was a discussion among prominent global leaders about normalization of the North American economy, and that is, with the NAFTA free trade agreement, you would have the Mexican economy going up, you'd have the Canadian economy going up, and the U.S. economy would go down. But the U.S. economy going down didn't matter that much. Now, publicly, they were like, no, it's going to be good for everybody, because what happens is Americans will be free to do higher skill labor and make more money. So if we have Mexico doing certain jobs and Canada doing certain jobs, Americans can take the higher level positions. That's literally not what happened. Said the same thing about China. If we give the labor to China, then we don't have to do the labor anymore, right? Makes sense. And then what happened? You basically deal with, what do they call it? When in the ocean floor, when the floor gets swept by a chemical, it kills all of the lowest life forms, and then it creates a rush all the way shooting up to the top where everything dies, because everything relies on the bottom.
Right.
This country can't exist without a working class base, and we've gotten rid of it. So now Trump says, we got to bring it back. That's going to be painful for Canada and Mexico.
Yes. So doing what I do, I travel all around the world having conversations outside. And I've been to about 20 different U.S. states. And I go to some of these cities, and the buildings are all 40, 50 years old. And it's a tragedy. And people are moving out, and there's empty buildings. And it is because of international trade. And Trump is right when he says that the U.S. has been getting taken advantage of. But this was done short-sightedly because they were able to bring in cheap product and take advantage of cheap labor and child labor overseas. So I understand what he's doing for sure. And Canadians just need to stop freaking out, because Canada as a country is not going to stop ceasing to exist, and all this drama is going to go away, and we're still going to have a trade agreement. But my gosh, what Canadians really need to focus on is the political people. We're going to have an election soon. We cannot elect another liberal government.
What do you think the best means to get the Canadian people to focus on that are? Because I personally, I agree your government is far too left, and for my liking, I don't like the idea of being sandwiched between two such incredibly leftist countries with Canada and Mexico. So is there anything that you think that the Canadian people or that Canadian influencers or whatever can do to kind of knock the Canadian people into realizing that these are bad policies, because the policies aren't going to change with the new guy?
So the difference with Canada is we don't have real conservative media. There are a few small companies. Rebel News does a great job. There are a few other smaller ones. We don't have the conservative radio network like you have in the U.S. I mean, you have tens of millions of people listening to conservative people on the radio. You've got all these huge podcasters like this guy, Tim Pool. We don't have any of that in Canada. We don't have these big influencers. I hate that term.
I'd be in jail if I was in Canada.
No, you'd be fine.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
I don't think so.
I say whatever I want in defiance of what the government wants, wherever I want. Nothing happens to me. What would happen is if you were employed, you'd be fired. For sure.
If I was in the UK, I'd be in jail.
Yeah, probably. Me too.
Yeah. Carl Benjamin was talking about that on the Lotus Eaters, that they're not allowed to say certain things due to the whatever Telecommunications Act or something in the UK. So like the politics is confined to acceptable means or something.
They're arresting people for praying.
Oh, I know. In the UK, there was a woman who was standing outside of an abortion clinic and said nothing and then closed her eyes. So they arrested her.
Yeah.
And they were like, you were praying in your head, weren't you? And she was like, no. And they're like, you're under arrest.
Yeah. And last year, there was a man, so he actually lost his child at this abortion clinic. And he's a Christian man. He wanted to pray. He didn't stand in front of the abortion clinic, but they have these buffer zones, they're called, around abortion clinics. You can't do anything. So he was standing about 200 feet away on a park across the street, standing by a tree, not impacting anybody, praying silently in his head, and they arrested him.
That's crazy. Praying silently in your head. Literal thought crime.
Literal thought crime, 200 feet away from an abortion
in the
clinic.
UK, yeah.
I got to pause. I think as much as we have our disagreements, Canada, we have to unite and invade the UK. We will liberate Carl Benjamin. Carl, we will save
We're going to come save you, Carl.
I want to abolish
Actually,
this
Carl,
parliamentary system all across the Commonwealth.
I don't know how people in the UK can still actually call themselves a free country knowing that happens. You literally get picked up and thrown in jail for thinking.
Let's not bring up Tommy Robinson and the stories he's pursued and what they've done to him. The UK is a horrifying nightmare dystopia. I got to be honest. If like 20 years ago, you were like, hey, look, man, V for Vendetta, that's a great idea and all for what you think the dystopia is going to look like. But I got a better idea. Roving bands of child rapists will run free while the government lets them go. And anyone who dares speak up will be locked up in solitary. People would be like, that's not realistic. Nobody would tolerate that. The view from most people was that in V for Vendetta, there's a disaster. The government says, we'll save you. Everyone says thank you. And then the government locks everyone down. You take a look at what's going on in the UK right now with arresting people over naughty words and letting other people get away with the most heinous of deeds. People couldn't fathom that the totalitarian government would act that way. They'd be like, no, they'd arrest everybody. Narco-tyranny.
They're literally letting pedophiles out of prison to make room for people who wrote mean things on social media.
Indeed. What a nightmarish place to live. And you know what? You know what the worst thing about the UK is? When you go to those little convenience stores and they have the cheese and onion sandwiches. Have you ever seen those?
What?
Yeah, it's like
What?
It's like minced onion with cheese whiz on bread, and it's ready to go, and it's delicious. But oh heavens me, it's terrifying.
It was a wartime delicacy.
It probably was.
Australia is just as bad
Oh, they have Vegemite.
for freedom of speech. Oh, well,
Oh yeah.
that's bad too. I had that once. I didn't like it. But for freedom of speech, they're terrible.
Did you guys see that Trump? I don't know why I bring this up, but he called Tesla Tesla.
Did he?
Yeah, it was the greatest thing ever. Because for those that don't know, the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth accent, except for Canadians, is to end your. And they don't know this. They always tell me I'm wrong, but they don't say they say So they said they used to call Obama Obamer. They don't say Obama. They say Obamer. And I'm like, that's his right name. That's correct. Thanks for checking out this clip from Timcast IRL. Make sure to watch the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. Subscribe to this channel, and we will see you all there.